So in Romans 14 verse 5, it seems that Paul is advising his followers to not worry about keeping the Sabbath day holy, but rather that they should esteem any day they like, they should pick any day they like to rest. And so we read this instruction that's often used to say that we don't need to keep the fourth commandment anymore. Let's test this. Hey guys, my name is PD and I hope you're doing awesome. So today we're going to look at this verse in Romans 14 verse 5 and I'm making this video because I've actually received quite a few comments and emails about this over a while now, and I just want to answer it kind of in one go for you guys, and I think I totally understand why people ask this question. It's very easy to read this one verse in Romans and think that Paul means that we cannot do whatever we want, we don't need to keep the Sabbath on a specific day. And I think the main issue here is an issue that is so prevalent in all of Christianity, and that's taking things out of its original context. Because if you look at the verse alone in isolation, it's very easy to make that conclusion. But if you read it in context, like we should always do, guys, we should always read the verses, the teachings, whatever. We should read it from verse 1 to the end. You cannot start in verse 5. You cannot understand the scriptures that way. So let's dive right in. He says in Romans 14 verse 5, in isolation, one indeed judges one day above another. Another judges every day alike. Let each one be completely persuaded in his own mind. Right, so first off, we need to understand that the Sabbath is not being mentioned in this verse, and in fact, the Sabbath is not mentioned in the entire book of Romans. The entire book of Romans, the letters written to the Romans, not once does Paul mention that he is talking about the Sabbath in any verse. So if Paul was to speak about a topic as prevalent and important as the Sabbath, the fourth commandment of God, at least he's going to mention the Sabbath once in the entire book, but he doesn't. So what is he talking about? 14 verse 1, and receive him who is weak in the belief, not criticizing his thoughts. One indeed believes to eat all food, but he who is weak eats only vegetables. He that eats, let him not despise him who does not eat. He that does not eat, let him not judge the one who does eat. For God receives him. Who are you to judge another man's servant? To his own masters he stands or falls, but he shall be made to stand, for God is able to make him stand. So in the first few verses, it is a clear thing now that we are seeing that Paul is here speaking about eating. He's speaking about food. Well, but this doesn't make any sense. What does this have to do with what's to come? Because as we're going to see now, the next few verses, he's going to talk about days. So first we see him talk about food and not judging people on what they eat in terms of, and then he connects that to days. And he says, one indeed judges one day above another. Another judges every day alike. Let each one be completely persuaded in his own mind. So he's talking about eating, and he's talking about what to eat, and he's talking about on which day to eat or on which day not to eat. What is that about? He who minds the day minds it to Yahweh, and he who does not mind the day to Yahweh, he does not mind it. He who eats, eats to Yahweh, for he gives thanks. And he who does not eat to Yahweh, he does not eat, and gives God thanks. So guys, it's starting to become very clear. He's talking about eating, and he's talking about on which day to eat. What he's talking about fasting. Fasting is there, in terms of fasting, it's about food, it's about what you eat. Some people fast only vegetables, some people eat nothing, some people fast water, whatever, and some people fast on a Tuesday, some people fast on a Wednesday, some people don't fast. And so Paul is here saying, don't judge your brother on which day to fast. And this starts becoming even more clear when we understand that there was a Pharisee teaching at that point in that day. A Pharisee doctrine, a Pharisee added man-made instruction, added to the law of God, not in the law of God, added to the law of God by the Pharisees, which taught that there are certain days of fasting. And it's kind of these traditions, okay, so on Monday and on Wednesday, we're going to fast. That's kind of the doctrine that they started creating, a man-made doctrine. And so the Pharisees went as far as to persecute people who did not fast the way that they did in terms of what they were eating and in terms of what day they were doing it. We see this where the Pharisees persecute Yeshua. He says, the Pharisee standing by himself prayed thus, God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all I get. And so we see this Pharisee looking at the tax collector, and he's kind of making this outward appearance statement, and he's saying, I fast, which is to do with food, twice a week, which is to do with days. So again, we are saying this thing. He's here saying, I'm a Pharisee, and I follow our Pharisaic teaching. I follow this doctrine of fasting twice a week, because the Bible never states, in the whole Bible, there's not this instruction that this Pharisee is describing of fasting twice a week. That is not an instruction in the Bible. There are certain days that the Father has instructed us to fast, but this is not one of them. There's none that points to what this Pharisee is describing. And so we read of how these Pharisees also persecuted Yeshua with this teaching. Mark 2 verse 18. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said to him, why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And so they're coming to Yeshua and his disciples saying, so all of these guys who are religious men of the day, they've got a tradition, they're fasting, why are you guys not fasting? In Yeshua, Jesus goes on and he says, I'm with them. Why would they fast while the bridegroom is with them? All right. But the point of the matter that I just want to make with you guys is that there is persecution around this. And there is a prevalent teaching clearly in that day around fasting. A teaching that Yeshua did not follow, a teaching not in the Word of God. Yeshua goes on to say, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do. For they preach but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens hard to bear and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. So Moses' seat was a seat in town way back where when anyone went to sit on the seat of Moses, it was in the city, they had to read from the book of Moses. They had to read from the Torah and the prophets. And so they couldn't, when they were sitting in that seat, they could not preach anything except for what was written in the Word of God. And so Yeshua here is saying, so go to them, go listen to them when they're on Moses' seat, and do and observe whatever they tell you. He's telling his disciples to observe whatever is in the book of Moses, whatever the Pharisees teaching while on that seat. And that includes the Sabbath day, the fourth commandment. It includes keeping the feast days of God. And so he goes on and he says, they tie up heavy burdens hard to bear. And he says, do and observe whatever they tell you, but don't practice what they do. Don't do what they do, because what they do is extra stuff, heavy burdens. And these heavy burdens aren't the teachings of Yeshua, aren't the teachings of God. It's extra stuff like fasting on certain days, which can become a burden if it starts becoming a prerequisite for being accepted by God or being saved or anything like that. So there's nothing wrong with fasting any day we want, but there is something wrong with imposing it as a restriction and adding to the Torah. Alright guys, so I hope that clears it up. As you guys can clearly see, this whole instruction that Paul is giving us in Romans has got nothing to do with the Sabbath day. Sabbath is not mentioned in the book of Romans, and so we cannot simply use this verse to say that we can just throw out the fourth commandment. God has established the Sabbath day as holy, set apart in the creation before the law was given even. And he rested. And I want to submit to you that God does not change. If He rested in Genesis, man, He's still resting today. He's still on the Sabbath going and saying, my son, my daughter, I'm resting. And He's going to rest whether you're resting or not. And He's going to pitch up for that date with you, because that's what the Sabbath is about. It's about communion and intimacy with the Father. And so the Father is going to pitch up for that date with you, whether you pitch up or not. And so I want to submit to you, brother and sister, it's time to start showing up with this date with the Father. We can rest on any day, and that's fine. But the Father has set aside a set-apart day as holy in creation and in His instructions, and that's Saturday. It's from Friday night to Saturday night that He has set apart as holy, and He calls us to meet Him there. So let us go and meet. It's blessed my life, it's changed my life, and it will do the same for you. Have an amazing day, guys. May God bless you and keep you. Check out my teaching on law versus grace, where this is coming from. Also my teaching on the Sabbath day and keeping it. I've got a whole playlist on the Sabbath, and check that out. Subscribe to His YouTube channel, and may God bless you and keep you, shine His face upon you, lift His countenance up upon you, give you strength and blessing, and I'll see you guys in the next video.